We like to think that we are civilized, that our rules are based on logic and reason. It is a comforting lie that hides the true nature of our society. Today, we will delve into the foundations, the first attempts to create order. You will see that humanity's operating system has always run on two things: absolute horror and grand stupidity. These are not just 50 strange laws. This is the source code of our own madness, embedded in the oldest societies and cultures. Let's start with a rule that strikes more by its absurdity than by punishment. The Hittites of ancient Anatolia had a code resembling a mad farmer's almanac. Especially strange were the laws concerning bestiality. The Hittites were obsessed with details, differentiating punishments depending on the animal with which a man engaged. If a man had sex with a horse or a mule, there was no punishment. It was simply considered an adventurous Saturday, with no consequences. But if a man did the same with a pig or a dog, he faced the death penalty. The law does not explain the reasons for this difference. Why is that? The law gives no explanation whatsoever. Share your theories in the comments, because we are completely baffled. Furthermore, the Middle Assyrian Empire was obsessed with social discipline and used clothing to strictly enforce it. By law, all respectable women, wives, widows, and daughters had to wear specific clothing to emphasize their social status. In ancient society, free men were required to wear a veil in public. However, prostitutes and slaves were forbidden by law to wear a veil. This was a legally established visual caste control. If a prostitute was caught wearing a veil, she was publicly humiliated, stripped, and whipped 50 times. Thus, she received harsh punishment for clothing that was too modest. This is a rare case of punishment for excessive modesty. In ancient Rome, the family was a very strict system. According to the law of the 12 tables, the head of the family held full power, called patria potestas. This power was so comprehensive that the father had the right to sell his own son into slavery. If the son was bought by a kind master and freed, he returned under the father's authority. A father could sell his son again. Only after the third sale and release did the son become legally independent. A tough childhood, undoubtedly. Now let's talk about Hammurabi's obsession with quality control. His famous code addresses an important issue: the quality of tavern keepers' work. If a female tavern owner served a poor quality drink, she faced severe punishment to ensure the reliability and honesty of trade. In ancient Babylon, punishment for bad beer or cheating with grain exchange was not just a bad review. The offender was thrown into the water. This was not just business rules, it was a promise. Beer in Babylon had to be good. Whoever served it risked ending up in the water forever. 5. The Hittites returned, this time without animals, but with strict price control. The details are simply ridiculous. A valuable plowing ox cost 12 shekels of silver, a regular ox 6, and an ox's height 1 shekel. They even evaluated live animals and meat after slaughter. It's more like the strictest Amazon catalog in the world. Bargaining was not allowed, nor was seeking discounts. The price was fixed, and violating it was considered a crime. 6. The Code of Uramu, one of the oldest legal texts, shows that justice was far from equal. He described punishments for divorce, and everything depended on the person's social status. If a man divorced his first wife, he had to pay her 1 mina of silver, which was a huge sum. But a former slave paid only 1/3 of a mina. This was a literal discount rate for breaking a marriage vow, written directly into the law. The law distinguished people by their social status in divorce. 7. Be careful what you sing. In ancient Rome, the 12 tables prohibited magical spells intended to harm another person. The law especially concerned magical songs that could steal a neighbor's harvest from his field and transfer it to yours. This was considered a crime. If caught stealing the harvest using magical karaoke, the punishment was death by execution. It didn't matter if someone was cursed. The main thing was the harvest. 8. What happens if your property harms another? The law of the horned bull from the book of Exodus offers a complex solution. If a bull killed a person, it was to be stoned to death, and the owner was freed from responsibility. This was considered an accident. However, if the owner knew the bull was aggressive and once when the bull was drunk and killed a person, its owner was also executed. This is one of the earliest and harshest laws on criminal negligence in history. The Romans were tired of excessive public mourning ceremonies. By the 12 tables, they decided to limit the number of professional mourners to 10. The law also forbade women from scratching their cheeks as a sign of grief because it had become a real problem. Imagine the government regulating excessive sadness. It's like a Roman official saying, "You can mourn, but let's keep it to a level 6 out of 10 in drama." Returning to Hammurabi, he had very strict views on professional responsibility, especially for doctors. If a doctor performed a serious operation and the patient died or lost an eye, the surgeon's hands were cut off. This was the harshest case of medical malpractice in the world. In ancient Sparta, there was a strict policy to ensure that no surgeon made the same mistake twice. The Spartans were obsessed with producing more Spartans. They had no tolerance for bachelors. In Sparta, a man was forbidden to remain unmarried after a certain age. The punishment was not a fine, but a ritual humiliation. Every winter, bachelors were forced to march naked through the market, singing a song that their shame was their own fault. Do you think such public shaming would help in your city? The Hittites were famous for their strange and very specific laws. Their legal code even had a separate section dedicated to bees. If someone stole a swarm of bees from another's hive, they had to pay a fine of 6 shekels of silver. But if the hive was empty, the fine was only 3 shekels. This means that they had a clear market value for bee swarms and hives. Let's take a pause and travel back to ancient Ireland, where the laws of the era were not so much harsh as full of amazing and subtle details. One of the rules was a strict attitude towards keeping cats on the farm. The cat had to guard the barn from mice, but the owner was obliged to ensure it did not become lazy or too fat. This punishment seems strangely kind and unusual among all the historical laws we have found. The Qin dynasty in China was known for its strict legalist philosophy, controlling everything, including people's emotions. One of the infamous decrees required mandatory expressions of mourning. If you did not cry at a relative's funeral, the punishment was severe. Refusing to cry at a funeral could result in the violent shaving of your beard and eyebrows as punishment. Imagine your boss checking if you are crying enough at your grandmother's funeral. How would you pretend? In Babylon under Hammurabi, not all blows were equal. Social status strictly determined the consequences of violence. If a nobleman struck another nobleman, the punishment differed from cases involving commoners, emphasizing social inequality. If a nobleman struck a commoner, he paid a fine. But if a nobleman struck a commoner, there was no punishment, and the commoner remained unprotected. If a commoner dared to strike a nobleman, he was publicly whipped 60 times. This was not just a system of privileges, but a legal VIP pass to violence. Many ancient laws were harsh, but some seemed almost progressive. In ancient Egypt, there was a law prohibiting mocking a bald person. Other cultures punished theft of cabbage by death, while the Egyptians sought to protect the feelings of those who lost their hair. This is possibly the world's first official safe space. The Vikings took insults very seriously. There was a formal legal ritual, the creation of a Enid or insult pole. This wooden pole was erected at the enemy's farm, accompanied by a curse. It was considered a high-level magical attack. The one who committed such an act could be declared an outlaw. It was not just monetary compensation, but a public declaration of war. The Code of Hammurabi allowed killing a person on the spot if they broke certain rules. It was a harsh and cruel code that allowed no mercy to offenders. Hammurabi had a terrifying rule for wet nurses. If a child died under their care, an investigation was conducted to determine the cause of the infant's death. If a wet nurse tried to hide the child's death by secretly replacing them with another child, her punishment was cruel and dreadful. Her breasts were cut off, a punishment reflecting the principle of an eye for an eye, but in the darkest and most literal sense. The Babylonians took the principle of justice to the extreme, applying it with horrifying literalness and without mercy. Think traffic jams are a modern phenomenon? Julius Caesar agreed with you. In the 1st century BC, Rome suffered from severe congestion. Thousands of carts and chariots created colossal traffic jams on the narrow Roman streets, obstructing movement and causing chaos. Caesar issued a decree banning most wheeled transport in the city center during the first 10 hours of the day. Only transport for construction, religious processions, and official state business was allowed. Others had to wait until evening. It is surprising that complaints about rush hour are a 2,000-year-old tradition, and Caesar was one of the first to understand it. The Code of Ur-Nammu, preceding Hammurabi, had a unique and frightening way of determining guilt in a crime. In ancient times, those accused of witchcraft were thrown into the river. If the person drowned, they were considered guilty, and the accuser could take their property. If they swam, they were considered innocent. Thus, the only way to prove innocence was to be a bad swimmer. Flawless logic that determined the fate of people accused of witchcraft. The ancient Athenians invented democracy and at the same time created an extreme form of cultural boycott, ostracism, which exiled politicians for 10 years. Every year, residents could vote to exile a politician even without a crime. It was enough to be too popular, influential, or simply annoying. If 6,000 people wrote the politician's name on a shard, he had to leave the city for a decade. Imagine the success that provokes such a response from society. In the ancient city of Horton, laws detailed fines for adultery, taking into account the social status of the participants. It was very strict and detailed. If a free man was caught with another man's wife, the fine was 100 staters. But if he was caught with a woman of a different status, the punishment differed. Slave women in their own house could be fined only 2 sterling. This was not just a law, but a price list of infidelity, where the dignity of some was worth 50 times more. Does such a division of justice by levels exist today? Share your opinion in the comments. Let's return to the Hittites, masters of precise purity rules, to learn more. One of the Hittite articles stated, "If a pig drinks from a vessel, the vessel becomes unclean. If a free person touches it, he also becomes unclean." The solution was not just to wash hands. A complex purification ritual involving a sheep had to be performed and a fine paid to the temple. Such religious bureaucracy was so complicated that washing dishes would require a lawyer to understand the rules. The ancient Hebrew law from the book of Leviticus possibly represents the world's first criminal code related to fashion. Mixed fabric clothing was forbidden. It was especially forbidden to wear fabric that was a blend of wool and linen. There are no dramatic punishments, but the prohibition itself is remarkable. For a society dealing with life and death issues, spending time banning mixed clothing seems unusual and strange. A special textile blend was a special kind of legislative priority. The worst fashion crime is not socks with sandals, but shats. Let's take a moment to return to common sense. This idea belongs to the Athenian statesman Solon. Before his reforms in the 6th century BC, Athens had a harsh system of debt slavery. If you couldn't repay a debt, your creditor had the legal right to enslave you and your entire family. Solon issued a radical decree that canceled all debts. This decree prohibited using a person's body as collateral. Now it seems like common sense, but back then banning the enslavement of the poor was truly revolutionary. The Qing dynasty in China took the idea of neighborhood surveillance to a terrifying extreme. The population was divided into groups of 5 to 10 families. According to their legalist doctrine, if someone in the group committed a crime, the others were obliged to report it. If they did not report, they received the same punishment. Often the punishment meant cutting the person in half. Thus, every neighbor became a potential guard and judge. The laws of Manu from ancient India were obsessed with preserving the caste system. One of the rules stated that if a person from a lower caste dared to teach a Brahmin, hot oil was poured into their mouth and ears. This is perhaps the most brutal, mind-your-own-business rule in history. What modern punishment can be compared to the penalty for unwanted advice to the boss? The Romans had an unusual approach to property rights called usucapio. If you openly owned someone else's property for a certain time, it became yours by law. The term is 1 year for movable property, 2 years for land. If the owner did not claim it back, the property passed to the possessor. So, if your neighbor borrowed your lawnmower and didn't return it for a year, it is now legally his. The Anglo-Saxons had a justice system similar to a bodily injury damage calculator. The laws detailed fines for any injuries. Knocking out a front tooth cost 8 shillings, while a canine was only 4. Cutting off the thumb was valued at a full 20 shillings. The little finger was worth just 9 shillings. It was a complete price list for dismemberment, as if justice was run by a grim accountant. In ancient Rome, being a Vestal Virgin was a great honor, but it required a strict condition: maintaining chastity for 30 years. Breaking this vow was considered a desecration of the entire state. The punishment was terrible. The guilty woman was locked in an underground chamber with food and water to die there. It was the most prestigious female position in Rome, with compensation that literally suffocated. Hammurabi devised a terrible rule against false accusations. An accuser in a capital crime who failed to prove guilt was subjected to the death penalty themselves. It was the principle of an eye for an eye applied to the judicial process itself to uphold justice. You were not merely a witness, but a gambler risking your own life, hoping the court would rule in your favor. This may have helped reduce court backlogs. The Vikings and Germanic tribes used a system called vergild, meaning man price, to avoid endless revenge killings by assigning a monetary value to human life. If you killed someone, instead of their family seeking revenge, you could pay a fixed price based on the victim's social rank to settle the dispute peacefully. Every person's vergild was based on social status. A nobleman's price was much higher than that of a farmer. This system was cold, but effective. What do you think your vergild would be today? Imagine placing a price on yourself based on your social standing and value in society. The ancient Indian laws of Manu defined a strict social structure where women were never independent throughout their lives. From childhood, a woman was subject to her father, in youth to her husband, and after his death to her sons, legally enforced by society. This was not a suggestion, but a cradle-to-grave ownership contract, where a human being was treated as property under the law. Imagine finding a human bone in a field. What would you do in such a situation? This raises questions about respect, law, and human dignity. If you were a Hittite, you would better keep your code of laws at hand. Their code provided a special procedure with the bone, delivery to the city, a ritual with a woman from the palace, and sacrifices. It was necessary to bring an ox, a sheep, and hold a feast. All this bureaucracy and expense for one found bone seemed insane and unbearable. Such legal confusion was so crazy that one would want to hide the bone themselves and pretend they saw nothing. In China during the Tang Dynasty, filial piety, absolute respect for parents, was the foundation of the law. This principle was so strict that filing a lawsuit against parents, regardless of the reason, was punishable by death. Even if parents hurt the child, a lawsuit against them was punished by death. Imagine how our lives would change. Ancient Irish laws of hospitality were very serious. Being a good host was not just polite, but legally mandatory. If a traveler came to you, you were obliged to provide him with quality food, drinks, and lodging. Failing to do so meant breaking the law. Hospitality was a matter of both honor and law in ancient Ireland. In the ancient world, guests could legally sue for damage to their honor. This was an ancient form of retaliation for negative reviews, but with real, legal consequences. Article 37. Ancient Athenians loved to argue, but public slander was forbidden. The politician's son introduced a law prohibiting insulting a living person publicly. The punishment was not fatal, but consisted of a fine. 3 drachmas were paid to the offended party, and another 2 went to the state treasury. It was a smart and practical solution to deal with trolls of antiquity, effectively silencing ill-wishers and maintaining order in society. The 38th point. In Hammurabi's law, There was an article about a wife who neglected the home, wandered the city, and humiliated her husband. In case of proven guilt, the husband had two options: to immediately divorce without a fine, or to take a second wife, leaving the first one in the house as a slave. These were truly enlightened options for resolving family conflicts in ancient times. The 39th point. In ancient Jewish law, property boundaries were sacred. One of the most severe curses in the book was related to violating these boundaries. Deuteronomy is intended for the person who moves the neighbor's boundary stone. This is not just theft, but a profound betrayal of public trust. The law does not prescribe physical punishment, but promises divine retribution. A simple stone becomes an object guarded by supernatural protection. The Romans were very suspicious of events after sunset. The 12 tables prohibited nighttime gatherings in the city. This ban was most likely aimed at preventing political conspiracies, but it was so broad that it prohibited any nighttime gatherings. It was a city curfew born out of pure paranoia. Any two people talking after dark were considered revolutionaries. In ancient Greece, especially in Athens, there was a special judicial process for inanimate objects that caused a person's death. Yes, you read that right. If a roof tile fell and killed someone, the tile itself was put on trial. The court heard the case, and if the object was found guilty, its sentence was formal exile from Attica, usually by throwing it out. In ancient China, during the Han Dynasty, officials were required to be impeccable, especially in managing calendars. The imperial calendar was considered a sacred document linked to the cosmic order. An error by an astronomer or court official, even by one day, was regarded as a colossal failure capable of bringing misfortune to the empire. The punishment for this mistake was death. This may be the only profession in history where a typo could lead to a death sentence. The strictness of the system was striking in its thoroughness and severity. The Visigoths, a Germanic people ruling parts of Spain, placed great importance on the integrity of their warriors' hair. For a Visigothic man, long hair symbolized freedom and status. Their law imposed a heavy fine if a free man's hair was forcibly cut. This was considered a grave insult, comparable to serious physical injury. What do you think could be the modern equivalent of a fine for violent, bad haircutting? The next part of the text is missing, so let's stop here and summarize. These laws show how important symbols and precision were in ancient cultures. The Romans were clearly afraid of a very specific type of theft: the kidnapping of a body from a grave. The 12 tables included a prohibition against such an act to prevent the use of the body in magical rituals. The laws also forbade removing clothes from the body before the funeral. The punishment for both crimes was very severe. It was a legal protection for a peaceful transition to the afterlife. Let's return to the laws of Ireland, full of wonderful pastoral absurdity. They had a law about bees that regulated the consequences of a bee sting and the related fines. If a bee stung you and you killed it in response, you were required to pay a fine to its owner. But if the sting was unprovoked and the bee died, its owner had to compensate you with part of the honey. This legal system understood that even bees must be held accountable for their actions. Such an approach demonstrates a remarkable respect for nature and justice. The Hittites had a special view on arson. If you set fire to a person's house, the punishment was very severe. The burnt dwelling had to be fully restored. But here's what's interesting. The law demanded the restoration of the house itself, not just a fine. This emphasized the importance of restoring justice and order in society. The ancient Hittite law states, if a house burns down, whether a person, livestock, or sheep are inside, the damage for them is not compensated. You are only responsible for the building materials of the house, but all living things that died inside are considered collateral damage without compensation. This is a strange insurance that covers only the structure, but not the contents of the house, which sets it apart from ancient rules. The ancient Sumerians may have invented the world's first alimony law, and it was harsh. According to the Ur-Nammu law, if a man divorced his first wife, he had to pay her a whole mina of silver, a huge sum. However, if a woman decided to divorce, her fate was darker. She was thrown into the river with a stone tied to her body. It was the most expensive way in the ancient world to say, "It's not you, it's me," during a divorce. In the Athenian legal system, there was a strange rule for murderers. The accused was allowed to make a speech in their defense. After the speech, but before the verdict was delivered, the accused was given a choice to voluntarily go into exile. If someone decided to leave, the trial would end immediately, and they would be forbidden from ever returning to Athens under penalty of death. This was a legal get-out-of-jail-free card, but the price was losing your home forever and never setting foot there again. The laws of Manu present another strange rule, seemingly written by someone who really hated garlic and similar foods. These ancient Indian texts classified garlic, onions, and mushrooms as forbidden foods for the upper castes due to their spiritual implications. Eating garlic and mushrooms was believed to inflame worldly passions and pollute the mind, making these foods spiritually dangerous. The reasoning was spiritual, but the rule was enforced like law, turning a simple mushroom stir-fry into an act of religious defiance. We have covered 49 points, and only one rule remains to be discussed before our grand finale arrives. Before revealing the final rule, it is time for the final verdict on the most unbelievably absurd law from today's list. In our opinion, the award goes to the Hittite law on bestiality, as it raises many baffling questions with no answers. The legal distinction between a horse and a pig remains a mystery for the ages, making this law particularly puzzling. Do you agree with our choice? Or did another rule deserve this questionable honor? Let us know your thoughts. Write in the comments what you think. And now our last item, 50. We conclude with the Hittite law, which seems incredible and almost unreal. The law states, if a wolf grabs a sheep and the sheep's owner sees it, the wolf must release it. But if the owner does not see it, the wolf keeps it. This is a real written law. It means that if the wolf is not caught in the act, the wolf becomes the legal owner of the sheep. The law sounds as if it was written by the wolf itself. It's easy to laugh at these ancient laws, but it's worth taking a closer look. The Code of Hammurabi was harsh, but extremely clear. If a builder's house collapsed and killed a person, the builder died. Cause and terrifying direct consequence. Today, corporations poison entire regions, and directors become richer through legal tricks. Legal tricks are incomprehensible to ordinary people. Now a question for you. What is worse, Cruel justice, understandable to all, or civilized justice, accessible only to the rich? What is your decision? Let's see who dares to choose a side in the comments. If you ask more questions than necessary, welcome home. Subscribe to the